Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's broadcast. We're very excited to welcome Steve Kenyon here to be joining us from Greener Pastures Ranching. Thank you very much for coming, Steve. Just before we get started, I just have a few little announcements here for upcoming events. I know it's the holiday season coming, but right after that, starting first thing in January, January 5th to 12th, is Grey Bruce Farmers Week. They're having a virtual event this year, and Beef Day will be happening on Wednesday, January 6th. So feel free to sign up for that. You can go to greybrucefarmersweek.ca for info and to register there. Shortly after that, on January 23rd and 30th, we are having a beef symposium this year. That's another virtual event coming up. So we'll be having 2 days of that. The first day, January 23rd, we're having a regenerative agriculture theme for that day. On the 30th, we're looking at cow-calf operations and feedlot operations and different focuses on those days. As well, the county and region's annual general meetings are approaching in December here shortly. They have just recently today were posted on our website, so those will be up, and the information will also be in our magazine that's shortly being sent out. As well, the annual general meeting for beef farmers is also being held virtual this year. So keep your eyes open for information regarding that. So those are some more upcoming events, just keep your eyes open for, as well as any others that might be coming up. Those are always on Twitter and on the newsletter that is always going out Friday, the bulletin board. With that, I'll send it over to Dan Ferguson, who will be introducing our speaker for the evening.
Hello, Beth. You can hear me okay on the phone here?
Yes, we can, Dan.
Great. Yeah. Well, welcome everybody tonight. We're glad to entertain the crowd for this evening's webinar. And I know that quite a few have logged in that might have other commitments tonight and will watch this later at their convenience. So tonight we have Steve Kenyon of Greener Pastures Ranching Limited, and we have been courting Steve for maybe the last year now, but of course we all know how much COVID has got in the way of our normal plans, and it is refreshing at this time of year as snow's coming and we're going into our winter hibernation mode to be able to look at Steve's, I'm expecting, very beautiful pictures of green grass and cattle grazing and nice shining high body condition cattle out on the grasslands of Alberta. So with that, I know that many of you have followed him and you keep track of him on social media, etc. But his grazing principles are something that has impressed different board members and staff at BFO. And our hope is that, with tonight's teaser, that we will be able to actually invite to Steve here in a better personal health climate once we get past all these issues currently, and we can have him here in person for one of our either cow-calf or feedlot management schools. And those events have been very well supported by our producers across Ontario, and that is the reason that we're kind of having this session tonight. I know a lot of you are zoomed out and had enough time with your computers lately, but this is an important subject. OMAFRA has done a great job, along with the sheep producers of Ontario and the beef producers of Ontario, in the last 3 sessions with their grazing cover crops. So quite a few of you are primed for this kind of a conversation tonight. And Steve's very much ready for a debate at the end of this conversation with our Q&A session. So he's open to any criticisms that you might have. And we all know that picturing that mob of cattle right in front of me now, whatever he's doing must be working. So we need to pay attention to his points and his details. And with that, I'll welcome Steve to Ontario, and hope we can see you soon in person here. And we expect a good presentation over the next 90 minutes or so, Steve. Thank you, and over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me out to Ontario, even though I'm not actually there. We're going to go through some different things here today. Some stuff maybe you've already seen, but I'm going to try and put a different angle on it here today. We're going to look at some of the basics, and then we're also going to look at some of the things that we've done lately to work with some grain farmers in our area as well. So I'm going to kind of go through a couple of different parts today. So soil life is better with cows around. There's that song you guys all heard from Corb Lund, right? Life's better with cows around. So making sure we can get going here. So I'm fairly well known for what's called year-round grazing. And the problem I have with that is that everybody thinks year-round grazing, everybody thinks winter, right? Right away it goes to, oh, what are you doing for swath grazing, or what are you doing for bale grazing? That's only a quarter of my year. So the most important part is not winter grazing, but everybody thinks it's winter grazing. Yeah, bale grazing sexy. People love to hear about swath grazing through the deep snow, but honestly, my business, it's a very small percentage of my gross revenue. Bale grazing is, there's some great things about both of them, but I just want to emphasize that that's not, the only thing I do. There's 4 seasons we need to deal with, and it's a year-round grazing system. We've got to, be doing good management in all 4 seasons. And the key part to my business is actually my spring and summer management. If I do a really good job at those, that sets the stage for the rest of my year. So much more important, much bigger emphasis on my business. My bottom dollar at the end of the year. My spring and summer management is crucial. That's the most important part. So, but I don't want to talk about year-round grazing today. I'm going to switch and challenge you. I want to kick you into a new thought process today, hopefully. I want to think about year-round soil building, okay? Forget about the grazing, forget about the animals and all the rotation. We're going to talk about that, but while we're doing this, I want you to think about building soil. And that's 365 days a year, right? I know a lot of people say, well, you're not going to be growing soil in the middle of winter, but we can do things and we can change our management to improve our soil building even in the middle of winter. So I just want to challenge you to think about that during this presentation here today. Okay. So basically, regenerative agriculture, a lot of people say it's this new way of farming, but actually it's a really old way of farming. I'm not really teaching anything new. It's kind of a lot of the old principles that we've kind of brought back. Modern agriculture has kind of taken over, and I personally believe led us down the wrong path, and we're going down in a spiral, and we need to pull ourselves out of that spiral. So what exactly is regenerative agriculture? I guess my definition is, well, modern agriculture today grows plants from the soil. Okay, so they take a seed, put it in the soil, add amendments to it, and they grow a plant, and it uses up the nutrients out of the soil. And then they harvest that and remove it. Okay, so we're taking nutrients from the soil and exporting it away. That's modern agriculture. So they're growing plants from the soil. Now, regenerative agriculture has a different look on it. So my definition would be regenerative agriculture grows the soil from the plants. Okay, there's a big difference there. It's a whole mindset shift. So we're taking plants and we're pulling nutrients from the air and we're building soil with it. Okay, totally different mindset than a lot of modern agricultural practices. So how do we grow soil? I was taught years ago that we can build soil very slowly by leaving residue. You build residue on the top and it decomposes and breaks down, and slowly, a lot of it will break down and be released back into the atmosphere, but we can slowly build soil that way. But it takes 30 years. I remember somebody telling me one time that it takes 30 years to regenerate soil. So there's also root decay. Okay, so those plants, as they grow, the roots dig down, and then when that plant dies, the end of the season, well, those roots start to decompose. Okay, and that's creating some soil. True, but that's also fairly slow. Okay, so that's where I started with. That's how I'm going to grow soil. It's a very long process, and it's going to take you 30 years. Okay, and then I learned about exudate. Exudate is was a foreign concept to me, big time. So when the plants are photosynthesizing, okay, they're the only thing on the planet that can, is the plants can pull carbon out of the air and turn it into glucose through photosynthesis. Now that glucose is transferred from the leaf down to the roots and helps to grow the roots, but at the same time it also pushes some of that glucose out through the root tips and adds it to the soil. Okay, so we're actually gluing soil particles together. So dirt is silt, sand, and clay. That's all it is. If we can start gluing those together with exudate, Now we're adding carbon, we're adding organic matter and gluing that together and gets good aggregation. So we can do this through the root plants, and that's feeding the microbiology in the soil, and it's building soil. So we're actually adding to what's existing there. Okay, so that root exudate is very important, and we can speed that up. We can do more of it by having good management above ground, right? For example, when we're doing good rotational grazing, every time you knock that plant down, right, we get another root decay because it'll slough off some of the root systems. And also, every time it grows up really quick, it's going to be pushing out exudate really quick. So we get a couple of rotations in, we're going to increase the amount of exudate that we're pushing into the soil. So compared to just leaving it grow for the season, letting it mature and then harvesting the crop. Okay, we're only getting one set of roots going down. We're only getting one, chance for exudate to be pushed into the soil. Whereas if we're grazing it, we can get multiple root penetrations. Okay, and then one more step that I learned, something called Mycorrhizae Fungi can actually take that exudate and convert it into glomalin. Now, glomalin is a much more stable form of carbon in the soil. It takes a lot more effort on nature's half to break it down. So if we can actually get that exudate into the soil and have mycorrhizae fungi present in the soil, we're going to store it and make it a lot more stable in the soil. Okay, so number 1 and 2 is really slow. Number 3 and 4 is a lot faster. We're talking 30 years versus 4 years, 4 or 5 years to be building soil. So it's pretty amazing to be able to manage those root systems to grow that soil. And what we need plants, we need soil organisms, and we need livestock to recycle it. Okay, part of today's talk is going to be about including livestock on cropland or grain land. I'm a very strong believer that every acre of arable land should have livestock on them. Okay, and we're going to go through some of those principles today. But that's the real basic, real quick and easy way to grow soil. So how can we do this 365 days a year? Or how can we improve our management to help it 365 days a year? We might not actually be, having plants exudate during the middle of winter, but we can set it up so that it's going to exudate better in the springtime. So a couple of pictures just to kind of show this. On the left-hand side here, we have 2 core samples that we pulled out. The one on the left is from our land, and the one on the right is from our neighbor's land. This was 2 pieces of land that were in a carbon sequestration study that we had done on our property here a few years ago. And previous management, they selected these 2 pieces because they were so similar for previous management, for terrain, for history, for, obviously rainfall. They're across the fence from one another. And the only difference was that 12 years earlier, I had started regeneratively grazing on the one on the left. So we've got quite a drastic difference in the soil profile because our root exudates have been adding carbon to that soil. So we're building that. You can see it in the picture on the right too. It's also from the one paddock, same as the dark one on the left. You can see the triangles that are going down. Okay, this is just a dug down. So we've got a thatch layer on top, and then we've got some soil underneath, and then we've got a triangle right here going down. We've got another bit of one here, and then we've got one on the right here that comes down. So what happened was there was a root that was penetrated down there, and it's been pushing exudate out. Okay, so we have a very clay-based soil. They call it Busby clay here. It's you rip off the topsoil, you're doing some work somewhere, and it rains, you end up with rubber boots that are about 30 pounds each. It just sticks to your rubber boots. So what we're doing is having those roots penetrate down, and every time we graze it, every time it regrows, we graze it again, it regrows, we're pushing exudate down into that soil. And we're actually converting our base. So we have a clay base, we're converting it into topsoil, right? We're not doing it really slow on top by leaving residue. We're doing that as well, but that honestly for me is more for water holding capacity. So those roots reaching down that's pushing carbon into the soil, and we're just converting that top layer. So much quicker and much easier way to do it than trying to leave residue on top. So I'm going to try and plan for that to get my soil in better shape or structure so that we can do that as much as we can throughout the year. So we're going to look at 5 grazing principles here first, just the basics of what I consider to be regenerative grazing. The water cycle, we're going to look at improving our sunlight harvesting. We're trying to recycle nutrients. We're building biology, that's an important part of it, and building polycultures. Okay, so we're going to look at each one of them here quickly. So if we're going to grow plants, for years, this has been the poster that they use at a lot of the fertilizer plants. If you've ever heard of the law of the minimum, basically it's your crop will grow to the point as the most limiting nutrient allows. Okay, and this barrel is always there. Now there's this P2O5 there is the lowest one in this example, and I'm always so frustrated when they use this because it makes no sense to me. I love the fact that they use this barrel, because what is the most important nutrient you need to add to your soil? It's pouring out of the barrel. It's water. By far, water is your most important nutrient, but nobody ever tells you to manage that. Okay, to me, that's the only nutrient I manage on my ranch. Okay, this, as an example, if you were to get a soil test back and you had the recommendations for what you needed to add to your soil, if the recommendation to grow X number of tons of forage or X number of bushels or whatever, if let's say it told you needed to put 50 pounds of nitrogen on, okay, in equivalent to grow that same amount of crop, you need 10,000 pounds of water. Okay, it's not even close. Water is by far your biggest limiting nutrient. And if you're in a really wet area, okay, then we need to have good soil structure to be able to let it drain away. Okay, that's the biggest issue. Good soil structure helps you in a dry environment because it helps hold on to water. But if you're in a really wet environment, good soil structure helps you drain it away better. Okay, so it's the same solution for the opposite problems. Soil structure can solve a lot of things. So let's talk about water. Okay. I love this quote. This is only part of the quote, but I didn't want to put too much on the screen. Once the soil was deep, it absorbed and kept the water. And this water soaked into the hills and fed streams, running streams everywhere. Now abandoned shrines at these dried up springs attest to the description of the land that's true. So this was written by Plato before Christ was born. Okay, he's describing a broken water cycle, how agriculture broke the water cycle. He's talking about in Greece, around all the castles and things there, they just destroyed the land. We're still doing the same thing today. More than 2,000 years later, we're still destroying our water cycle. That's probably the biggest one thing we could do to help mitigate climate change on our planet right now, is fix the water cycle on a global scale. It would be incredible what that would change. But we've damaged it in so many places in so many ways that it's almost past fixing. So we need to work on the water cycle. So how do we do that? Water can be lost in 4 ways. One, obviously, runoff. When the water comes down, hits bare soil, what it does is it caps the soil. That raindrop that comes down, it's kind of like a small explosion, a hand grenade that goes off. It's very powerful. So it explodes and breaks the soil structure. So remember we talked about the exudate gluing soil particles together and making aggregates? Well, now that raindrop comes down and it's a lot stronger than the soil. It explodes and it breaks it apart. So this, all of a sudden we're back to silt, sand, and clay. And what happens to the organic matter or the carbon that was there? Well, it gets washed away. So we're losing all that good stuff. That second raindrop that comes down hits this capped soil and it has to run off. So now we're losing the water and it's going to take all the organic matter with it. Soil erosion is a major loss of our carbon out of our soils. Okay? So what we need to do to fix that is we need to have live plant material, live or dead plant material on the soil surface. So prevent that first raindrop from hitting bare soil. Okay, so the raindrop is tougher than the soil, but the plants are tougher than the raindrop. So now this time that raindrop comes down and instead of that explosion damaging the soil structure, the raindrop comes down, hits that plant matter, live or dead plants, and now the raindrop bursts into tiny little particles because the soil armor, we call it, is stronger. And now that little particles can soak down into the soil and not cause the damage. Okay, so we seriously need to work on fixing our water cycle and prevent this runoff. Okay, number 2 is evaporation. So once we do get a little bit of moisture in the soil, we want to hold on to it. We don't want it to evaporate as quickly. If we can cover the soil, that reduces the amount of evaporation. So what happens in the soil, though? Moisture does not work by gravity. Okay? Rainfall comes down by gravity. Once it's in the soil, it now works by diffusion. Now, diffusion is a movement from an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser concentration. So in this case, it would be wet to dry. Okay, so that let's say you got some bare soil exposed, the wind's blowing across it, the sun's beating down on it, warming it up, and just like water does, it'll evaporate. Okay, now the big problem here is now the soil moisture from down below will move by diffusion. It will move up to where it's drier. Okay, now it'll evaporate, and then more moisture will move up to where it's drier, and it'll evaporate. What happens is this causes a reverse water cycle. Okay, reverse water cycle is the moisture is evaporating out of our soil, going up into the air, condensating, precipitating down is rainfall, hitting the soil, causing cap soil, which now the raindrops will start to run off and will fill our water bodies from surface runoff. Okay, that's a negative or a backwards water cycle. And what we need to have happen is for the rain to come down, soak into the land, infiltrate down and soak away, and fill our water bodies from below ground through infiltration. Okay, that's a healthy water cycle. We want the moisture to evaporate out of your water bodies and then rain down. So that's our healthy water cycle that we need to build. We can solve both these issues with leaving more residue. Okay, I might say it more than once tonight. If I could go back and tell myself 20 years ago the one thing to do better, it would be to leave more residue. Okay, don't take everything all the time. The other one is infiltration. Now I know you guys in Ontario might be most places are a lot wetter than us, and you're worried about that. You've got drainage and things you're dealing with all the time. But what I need to do, or we need to work on, is letting it infiltrate and dissipate down through the ground. But I want it to go fairly slowly. I don't want it to. If you've got a really sandy soil, I don't want it to disappear too quick. We want it to absorb it quick, but we don't want it to disappear quick. Okay, so infiltration can be good or it can be bad, but how we fix that? Root systems that build soil structure, and that's going to help with it. Okay, so that's a healthy water cycle. The fourth way is what we really want, is plant utilization. So what this describes is the difference between actual rainfall and effective rainfall. Okay, so your actual rainfall is what ends up in your rain gauge. That's all 4 of these. Your effective rainfall is what your plants get to use. So your number 4 is plant utilization. Okay, we need to reduce the amount of runoff, reduce the amount of evaporation, and manage the infiltration. Okay, and that's how we fix a water cycle. The number 1 thing we could do is managing this cycle. I believe for your farm and for our planet, I think that's what we need to work on. Okay. Also, riparian area management. I know there's a lot of people who love to do drainage. Back in my mind, it makes me irk every time I see somebody doing drainage. We need to manage this. Our environments are set up to have water storage. We end up with major flooding issues downstream, millions and millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, trying to deal with flood management. It's because we've drained so much land. I think honestly, if you have to drain a piece of land, you should have to build a catchment to hold on to that amount of water somewhere at the end of it. But to me, the beaver is my best friend. I love when the beavers show up and back up some water and back up some areas. So to me, that water catchment is a very important part. And not just for the water cycle, but also for my management, my predator insects, my biodiversity in my system. It all works together. We can't look at one individual thing. We have systems that work together. Dragonfly breeding grounds, spiders, red velvet mites, all sorts of critters very dependent on these riparian areas. And if they're a part of my operation, that's a huge thing for me. Quick example, I had a piece of grain land I took over 2 years ago, and we would go down there, go fencing, and the mosquitoes were absolutely incredible. So they were spraying right up next to the dugout, tillage right as close as they can all the time. And then we took over this little area in the middle of it with grazing management. And so I backed off the fence from his grain land. I asked permission, obviously, but I told him the benefits that we're going to get. So backed the fence off probably 30 yards or so. Started protecting that riparian area. I remember my wife wouldn't even go down there. She wouldn't get out of the car. The mosquitoes were so bad. Within a year and a half, we had dragonfly hatchings, and we had thousands and thousands of dragonflies around, and the mosquitoes were basically gone. Just with a little riparian area management. So those dragonflies are also going to be managing some of the pests on his grain fields as well, because we manage that little riparian area. So very important in the whole scheme of things. Okay, so water cycle. We also have to manage our sunlight harvesting. To me, sunlight is the basis to what we're doing. If it wasn't for the sunlight, we wouldn't have life on this planet. So I'm going to try and get as much sunlight harvesting as I can. Another priority on my ranch. Okay. So how do we do that? How do we run around and catch more sunbeams? I picture every piece of grass out there, every forage, every legume out there as a solar panel. Okay, I want to catch as much sun as I can with those solar panels. So can I lengthen the growing season? Pretty tough. Here in Alberta, we got about 4.5 months. So we have 4.5 months to be able to grow 12 months worth of feed. So that's, there's a lot of places that have a lot more advantage over us. But I can get as much of that as I can. Okay, nature pretty well dictates when it starts growing and when it ends growing for me. But I want to get as much as I can. So I want to favor the grass to get an early spring start. So as soon as the temperature's warm enough in the spring, I want my plants jumping out of the ground. I want moisture in the ground. I want my ground to warm up quick, right? I don't want the frost to go too deep, so I want good residue cover. I want nutrients available, so I've got a good nutrient recycling going. I want to make sure the water's there, so if I left residue there, we've held on to water so it hasn't evaporated. I don't want my plants overgrazed the year before, so that the root reserves are there and just ready to jump when that temperature is warm enough. Okay, so I want to have my plants jumping out of the ground first thing in the spring. I'll have 6 to 8 inches growing, and my neighbors hasn't even started yet. So that makes a big difference to me. I also want to maximize late season growth. So, when it's cooling off in the fall, we're getting mid-September is usually about our killing frost. I want enough residue on that ground still left out there that I'm insulating that. The plants aren't necessarily dying because of that first frost, because I get a couple extra weeks because my grass is still growing and my neighbors died off. I also want my plants not chewed off into stage 1 grasses, or I don't want them maturing into stage 3. So if I can get good, healthy stage 2 plants out there in the fall, we're still collecting sunlight. Okay. Yeah, and that throughout the whole season, I want that optimum stage of growth. Okay. I also want to have drought resilience. If I, let's say in the middle of summer, we go 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month without any rain at all. Okay. Honestly, I've got neighbors next to me that their plants will shut down completely after about 2 weeks because there's no water holding capacity. The water runs off and then it evaporates really quick. Most of my pastures, we can easily go a month or maybe even 2 months without a drop of rain, and they don't even hesitate. They're still actively growing. They don't slow down. Whereas my neighbors, you get a month without rain, they got 2 weeks where there's nothing growing. So they're not harvesting sunlight during that time. I want to make sure that I get my full 4.5 months of growing season. Every sunbeam that comes down, I want it collecting. I don't want it hitting bare dirt. When sunlight comes down, it hits bare dirt, it gets reflected. There's a measurement term that they use when they came out with the carbon sequestration study. They used it. They had a drone actually that measured it, albedo. So that's the amount of sunlight coming down versus the amount of sunlight being reflected. So you want your reflected light to be as low as possible compared to the amount coming down. That means your plants are absorbing as much as it can. So another tool that I'd love to be able to monitor on a constant basis. Okay, so here's the example. This pasture, I mean, how much is being reflected? Okay, we don't want this. We need to cover the ground. We need to get it so it's collecting sunlight. So this was a pasture from a long time ago. This is what I took over. The first couple of years, I left a lot of residue, tried to build up that water holding capacity. Didn't necessarily take a lot of cash flow out of it. because I was trying to heal it. And just as quick example, this is what it looks like today. Well, not today, it'd be covered in snow today, but last summer I took this picture. So we've built it up so now that it is got the water holding capacity, and now it can harvest sun as much as we can throughout the entire growing season. Third principle is nutrient recycling. This is a big part that modern agriculture is totally oblivion to. They totally miss this point. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. Okay? It's a law of conservation of mass. There is a set amount of carbon on this planet. Okay? You can't make it or you can't destroy it. There's a set amount. There's a set amount of nitrogen on this planet, set amount of hydrogen and oxygen. Okay? Everything has a cycle. And if it's out of balance, right? If we've got a shortage of something, it's because we've messed up the balance, right? We've screwed up the cycle. There's no such thing as a water shortage, right? A water shortage is caused because we've screwed up the cycle. And now in one area at one time, we don't have any because it's in another part of the cycle. And usually it's because of something we've done, right? Human interference. So carbon, right? Yeah, we got too much carbon in the air. Well, it's because we've screwed it up. We've screwed the cycle up. There's not enough left in the soil. There's not enough left in the forests. So we need to fix the cycles, and modern agriculture is missing that point. Even in your land, okay, we need to have a cycle. If you keep exporting nutrients, what do you expect is going to happen? Okay, we have to figure out how to grow a crop and sell it without exporting all of it, right? Try and keep as much of it as possible on the land. So that's where the grazing animal comes in. They are very inefficient, and being inefficient makes them very effective. Okay, 80% of what comes into a cow comes out the back end. Okay, 80% inefficiency. That goes against every fiber in your body. Probably you want to be as efficient as possible. If man made the cow, right? If we made a replica, a machine to do the job of the cow, I'm sure man would want to make her 97% efficient. Okay, because that's how we think, and it's wrong. We need to have her recycling, right? That's the whole reason why we've got livestock, or nature put livestock out there, is to recycle the nutrients. If you look at across the planet, where nature put ruminant animals, okay, ruminants are cows, bison, elephants. They're all in environments with dormant seasons. Okay, nature does not need a ruminant animal in the rainforest. Okay. In the rainforest, there is active soil life all the time, bacteria, fungus, and critters in there that are constantly recycling nutrients, and the soil life doesn't die. Okay. In a dormant season like our winter, then all of a sudden everything goes dormant, and we can't decompose and break down all the nutrients or recycling all that material. So we've got a ruminant animal. All nature did was put the bacteria inside the rumen. Okay, now we've still got our bacteria to decompose plant material, but it's inside the rumen of the livestock. So we need those animals out there to be recycling nutrients during those dormant seasons. And yeah, it makes it a very inefficient animal that's very effective. In a grain operation, we're probably exporting 80 to 90% of the nutrients off your land. Okay, it's gone, right? And now you have to replace it, and it costs a lot of money, and it's a very negative carbon footprint to be able to do that. In a haying operation, you might be bringing in some nitrogen with your legumes, but you're exporting everything else. Okay, it's leaving your land. How can you figure out how to harvest it and sell a crop without it leaving your land? And we might have to ship some of it out, but it's a lot cheaper to replace the 20% because that cow is only exporting 20%, whereas the grain and the hay is maybe 70% plus that it's exporting. So we need to get livestock on the grain land to at least help get it recycling and get some of that nutrients breaking down. If not, a lot of that nutrients is actually volatilizing off, right? You're not getting that nutrients back. Okay, so we need this. Okay, this is my soil health improvement treatment. We need to have it out the back end of the cow and back onto the ground. And you lose the efficiency of this product when you have to haul it yourself. Okay, the primary producer should be putting it out there for you. Okay, that leads to our next component, building biology. Okay. Most soils do not have a fertility issue. Okay. We don't have a fertility issue in agriculture. We have a biological issue, and we're trying to mask that with fertility. Okay. 85 to 90% of plant nutrition is microbiotically mediated. We need biology in the soil. We need biology in our systems. Okay. That's the key. I haven't used fertilizer in 20 years, and I don't ever plan to. I haven't hauled manure in 20 years. Okay. But I've got some fantastic looking crops out there because we build biology. If you can build the biology, you get it for free. You don't need to buy inputs. So living organisms, I call them my employees. They work for room and board. Someone made a joke the other day for me, so I'll kind of throw it in here. For room and board, right? They're in the rumen. Pretty good anyway. Earthworms, dung beetles, microbes, protozoa, nematodes, yeast, fungi, algae. These are all employees. They work for me. Okay, I need to give them food, water, and shelter. That's it. They're the best employees I've ever had. They never take a day off. They don't have sick days. They work until they die, actually. It's very, very dedicated employees. So anybody want to come work for me? Taking applications? So let's talk about just a few of them here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but bacteria. There's 4 basic types of bacteria in the soil. There's decomposers. They're recycling nutrients all the time. They're breaking down the manure. They're breaking down the litter and the material. They're even decomposing other biology. Okay, there's some, it's a life and death situation out there. So we've got some critters that are decomposing other critters. And that recycling of that nutrient is very important. We have mutualists, and I always say they're a part of the black market. There's a secret underground black market going on out there, and they're constantly trading back nutrients with the plants. Okay, so in this black market is actually it's run by the mob. The mob is the plants, and the reason they control this whole black market is because they produce the currency. The currency underground is actually sugar, and it's produced by the plants only. So if you can control the currency, man, you've got control of the whole system. So picture these little bacteria running around. They're mutualists. They need sugar to live, right? It's a life and death situation for them. So let's say they want to, get some sugar. Well, they got to give something to the plant. So they'll go over and find a molecule of nitrogen, grab that molecule of nitrogen and bring it in, give it to the plant in exchange for a molecule of carbon or sugar. And that's how they survive. So it's this constant trading of nutrients back and forth. There's also pathogens. Like I said, some bugs like to eat other bugs. It's not always a bad thing because we need to have that life and death turnover to recycle the nutrients back and forth. Some of it's controlling pests and parasites and things like that as well, so not always a bad thing. And the 4th type is litrotrophs. Now they're involved with nitrogen cycling, but also importantly, pollutant degradation. So we like to poison our environment, right? We're really good at that. But if we have a healthy system, we actually have bacteria out there that can decompose some of that stuff that we do. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't have all the details behind that, but I know very well that we've got critters out there that will decompose and break down pollutants that we put out there. So we got to have that healthy system going. And you know what? Maybe some of those, things that we have in our systems aren't as bad as we make them out to be if we have proper biology, because they can resolve the issue for us. So real quick on bacteria. I already talked quickly about Mycorrhizae fungi before and how they build up glomalin, but the real powerful thing about Mycorrhizae fungi is their network of hyphae. So they've got arbuscules that join with the plant roots, and then they've got hyphae that reach out into the soil, and they actually basically act like an extension of the root hairs. Very fine fungus that's these hyphae that reach out, and they can bring nutrients back to the plants. They're really good with this black market. They'll bring whatever the plant needs in exchange for sugar. Like they got to survive as well. They have to survive on sugar. So could you imagine how much better your plants would do if it had 1,000 times more reach with its root system? Okay. And one of the amazing things is if you get in a drought situation, this Mycorrhizae fungi can actually just bring water to the plants and trade them. So, how much better would your plants do in a drought, right? I explained to you my neighbor's land versus my land. Well, that's why I can get through a drought, because my Mycorrhizae fungi is in the soil reaching out for me. So they're helping out. So they're kind of like the enforcer and the tough guys in the soil of this underground black market. they're in charge of transportation and distribution. So mycorrhizae fungi is really important in my soil. How about earthworms? Earthworms are amazing critters in the soil. They can do all sorts of stuff for us. They recycle plant material and dung, obviously. They are actually heaven for microbes. You want to increase your microbiology life in your soil, get more earthworms. They can create 100 times more microbes in your soil if you've got a healthy population of earthworms. They like to create paths for roots, water, and air to get down, so they help with infiltration. They help with roots digging around. They also buffer the soil. If you've got an acidic soil, or if you have an acid soil, whatever comes out the back end of an earthworm is pH neutral, right? So everybody's always stressing out about, you know, your pH of your soil is wrong, and boy, we got to put some lime out there, or whatever you got to do. I had a agrologist come out to my land here quite a number of years ago now, and he tested all my soil, and you know, we were trying to figure out why my legumes weren't staying in, and his answer to me was that we're short of sulfur. Our area is low in sulfur, and the legumes really like sulfur. But he said to me, that he's never seen soil with such healthy soil characteristics as mine. Right, my pH was perfect, and I've got 3 to 5 earthworms in every shovelful. Okay, they're constantly out there buffering the soil for me. So if I have that, you know, 5 earthworms per square foot, and that's 20,000 earthworms per acre on my land, I've got 700 million employees that I'm managing just in earthworms alone. So yeah, I've got my own vermicast program going here at the ranch. Dung beetles are always popular. So I'm not going to show a whole bunch about dung beetles today, but just the basics of them. There's 3 different types of dung beetles. They're very important on my ranch. We've got dwellers. They kind of hang out, you know, in and just below the dung pat, and they what they do is they take a ball of manure, put their larvae inside it, and then bury it, and then the larvae actually consumes the manure to become an adult. That's how they do it. Number 2 is tunnelers. I'd love to have more tunnelers here. We have a few, but not very many. We're pretty cold in our part of the world, so we don't get very many of them. Most of ours are dwellers, but they do the same thing, but they tunnel down under the ground, and they put that ball of manure down there with their larvae inside it, and the larvae eats the manure to become an adult. Now, they don't eat all of it, so they leave a bunch of it down there. So it's just transferring nutrients down underground into different root zones. And also those tunnels are, you know, air, just like earthworms, air infiltration, water infiltration, paths for roots, wonderful things to your soil. And the third one is a roller. They'll grab a ball of manure, form it, and then roll it away, and then they'll bury it somewhere else and find a nice soft spot to bury it. So they're moving nutrients around as well. Now, in Canada, we have very few rollers, maybe in the lower, warmer areas of Canada, but yeah, not up here. We don't have any rollers. Therefore, you know, the most famous one is that elephant dung beetle. He's like this big, and yeah, he doesn't take crap from just anybody. So dung beetles are very important in my system for recycling nutrients. So I could go on. I've got a whole presentation on insects and bugs and critters, but basically I'd like to, you know, quote Dr. Matt Van Steelen here. He's a veterinarian out of Manitoba. We need to replace pharmacology with pharmacology. Okay, the dragonflies, the red velvet mites, parasitic wasps, earthworms, hairy rove beetles, these are all very important critters on my ranch. And if I throw out a bunch of pharmacology out there, a bunch of chemicals, we're hurting them. Okay, we need to manage this whole system and all these critters together. So very important on my ranch. Okay, and the 5th principle, a polyculture. I want to make sure that we've set up a polyculture in our environments. We are so stuck in agriculture on a monoculture, and I just want to make sure you guys are all aware that a monoculture is ugly. I hate them. Drive past any monoculture and I'm disgusted by them. I know everybody else thinks they're pretty. We're trained in our society to have a straight line, to have perfect fields. Right? You get criticized if you miss something and there's a few weeds out there. That is so wrong, so wrong. Think about the bees. Okay? If you've got a monoculture, you've got one time of the year where you've got a whole bunch of flowers, right? That's where the pollination, that's where their food source is. How do they survive the rest of the year? Okay, we need that polyculture of plants to get flowers and all throughout the whole season. Okay, there's a reason why dandelions flower so early in the year, right? The bees need a source of food early in the season. So I'm going to emphasize it again. A monoculture is ugly. You guys have all heard that song. She ain't pretty, she just looks that way. Yeah, that's what a monoculture is to me. It's not pretty, not at all. Perennial polyculture, now that's beauty. Right? Look at that. That is a beautiful crop right there. Polyculture, there's some sweet clover there. There's other clovers, there's grasses. That is a beautiful crop. And if anybody's worried about weeds on their land, nature doesn't have, there's no such thing as a weed. There's a reason for every one of those plants. And if you come to my ranch, you may say that there's weeds out there. I call it a polyculture. Now, if a particular species is taking over an area, yes, there might be an imbalance of something and we need to adjust it. But you see that thistle my daughter's, holding on to there? You can't even tell it's a thistle. It is just part of that beautiful polyculture. And that thistle's there for a reason. That root system is doing different things than the plant right beside it. It's feeding different biology. Flowers at the different time of the year. There's nothing wrong with having that thistle plant right there. So we are so hooked on this monoculture. It's got to be perfect thing in our society, and I just can't handle that. We've got to get away from that thinking. You want to learn a little more about that, if you go to the Canadian Cattlemen website. This is my daughter Dana, and she wrote a fantastic article. It's called Just Another Weed Hugger. So if you went there and you searched Dana Kenyon, it would pop up. Fantastic article. I may be a little bit biased, just so you know. So those are the five grazing principles. Real quickly, I'm just going to go through the concepts here. I'm not going to get into detail on them, but there's also some concepts that we manage. So I would say the principles are the why, and the concepts are the how. Okay, this is how we manage to get all those benefits that we were just talking about. So we have to have a graze period and a short enough that we're not going to overgraze plants, and we have to have a rest period long enough that we allow the root reserves or the energy stores to be replenished. So that's how we do our rotation. We're managing for a short graze period and a long rest period. Picture when you take a crop of hay off. Okay, your haybine goes out there and you hopefully cut it down in one day, and then you let it rest and let it regrow again to about late stage 2, just into flowering. Okay, that's all I'm doing with my grazing. But I have to, I can't park my equipment in the shed for the summer. I have to be able to manage it. So that's what we're doing with the rotation. We've got a whole bunch of little hay fields out there that we're trying to knock it down real quickly, and then we're trying to give it lots of time to rest. Simple, same idea with graze period and rest period. We just have to keep those animals moving because they have to eat every day. We can't park them in a shed. Animal impact's very important. That is the physical stimulation on the soil by the animal's hooves. Okay, that's what I used to say all the time. That was the only part of it. Very important. It breaks up capped soil. It helps push that plant material down to contact the soil, so it gets recycled better. It can stimulate new seedlings to develop. Very important, that animal impact, that physical stimulation on the soil. There's another side to it, though. There's also a biological animal impact. Okay, the biology that comes with the animals. Okay, we've got biology in the manure, we've got biology in the urine, we've got biology in the saliva, we got biology in the snot that's dribbling out of their nose. That that thing that makes me gag a little bit when I see it. We've also got the biology that's falling off their hair coat. Okay, or we've got some of this as food for biology in the soil. There's symbiotic relationships between those animals, those ruminant animals, and the soil life. So the biology between them have these relationships, and it needs it. We can't separate them. It's a whole system that we're putting together. So that biological impact, you don't get that from the haybine, you don't get that from the set of harrows. So you can get some of that physical stimulation with equipment, but you can't get that biology. And if you do get that biology, composting and compost teas, things like that, they're costly, right? All that adds up and adds up. There's no better compost tea than the urine that comes out of an animal. And there's no better compost than the manure that comes out of the back of the animal, okay? We need to eliminate those processes and put them directly on the soil by the primary producer, the ruminant. Okay, so animal impact is really important in my operation. Especially, we're going to talk about the grain land coming up. Especially, we got to get that animal impact out onto that cropland. Stock density is an important part. There's two parts to stock density. So let's look at the definition here first. Stock density is the number of animals per acre at a given time. Okay, the other term would be stocking rate, which would be the number of animals for the whole season on your pasture. Okay, we're not talking about stocking rate. We're going to talk about stock density. Basically, how tightly they graze together or how spread apart they are. Okay, so a high stock density, they're really tight together, and a low stock density, they spread apart and they can go where they want. So the higher the stock density, the better. The two reasons why, one is better plant utilization, and the other one is better manure distribution. Okay, so let's look at plant utilization. Picture that haybine going across the field again, right? It cuts every plant. It's knocked down. So no plant has an advantage. And so that's what we're trying to mimic with stock density, is if we can get the cattle out there grazing and they can knock down, step on, poop on, somehow flatten it, every plant, then no plant has an advantage. Okay, so the higher the stock density, the better that works. On the other side of the scale, if we do continuous grazing, the cattle get to go out and pick and choose, and they eat all the best plants, and all of the undesirables, which everybody else calls weeds, end up being prolific, right? They don't get grazed, they get to reproduce and go to seed, and they have the perfect life. So with high stock density, we basically make the playing field equal for everybody. Everybody has the same chance to regrow. Those undesirables don't get the advantage. Okay? And the other benefit is the increased manure distribution. Right? The higher the stock density, the better we spread it around. The urine and the manure get spread around in a more even fashion. If we got a really low stock density, all the manure and urine ends up in one or two places, right? By the trees, by the watering area. Our nutrient transfer is not very even. So we've got to keep that stock density nice and high. And the last one is soil armor. This is basically what I told you before. One of the biggest mistakes I made. If I could go back 20 years and tell myself one thing to do better is leave more residue. If I could leave more residue on the soil surface, that's going to help me build up my water holding capacity. It's going to insulate my soil. It's going to stop the evaporation and the runoff. It's just amazing what that soil armor can do. So yeah, leave more residue and you'll heal your land so much faster. And I know, I was a young farmer starting out, and if I could leave my cattle out on every paddock for one extra day, right at the end of the season, that's a couple $1,000. That helps put diapers on bums and food on the table. But if I could leave as much as I can, I'd be further ahead today. Okay, it's that short-term cash flow. What do I get out of it now versus that long-term sustainability? In 2 years, my land's going to be a lot better shape if I can leave it this year. Okay, so those are the 5 concepts that we need to look at. Now, if you want to remember them, just look at the first letter of each one. GRASS spells grass. Sorry, just need a sip. Oh, my tea's getting pretty cold. Okay, so to do that, we need to do some kind of rotation. Now, I'm not going to go into cell design here today, but just to show you that grace period, rest period, we need to put up some fencing. Right? One of the most important things I do on my ranch is fencing, and trying to design different cell designs. Every piece of land's different. We got a whole nother presentation on cell design. So, but we were talking at the beginning about this year-round grazing thing, or I should say year-round soil building. What can we do in the spring to build soil? Well, we've got to get it going as soon as possible. I talked about different ways to get that going as soon as the ground, it's warm enough out there. I want the ground insulated well. I want the moisture there. I want the nutrients there. And then we start with a really quick rotation and get those plants stimulated with grazing, stimulated with biology, getting more exudate going out. As soon as we knock it down, we'll get a second growth coming up, so we can get extra grazing or extra soil building with that good rotational grazing early in the spring. And during the summer, yeah, same thing. We're still trying to keep those plants in that vegetative state, trying to keep the exudate going down, trying to build up, better environments for our mycorrhizae fungi to be building glomalin. Really important to be managing well out there for those two. So those 2 seasons, most important part of my business, right? I mean, that sets the stage for the rest of the year, because that leads into fall grazing. I think I'm going to switch here, yeah, into fall. So the better I can do in my summer management, the longer I get to graze. So for my livestock side of it, yeah, I'm going to feed less hay or feed less silage in the wintertime if I can graze longer. So two different ways that I've basically done fall grazing before is if I can keep that, good grazing management going in the summertime, I'll extend as long as possible. Now, with a 4.5-month growing season, right? I don't have much time to grow it. Pretty hard to get 12 months of grazing out of that without some little tricks. So one of the tricks that I use is a deferred, not deferred, a disposable herd. Okay, so I'll have 2 herds on one pasture, right? They'll each have half of it, let's say. Maybe one will be a group of yearlings and one will be a group of cows. So both herds will have separate pastures, and they'll each have their rotation. But one of them, the yearling herd, will be a disposable herd. So depending on the season is when I get rid of them. If we're having a really good year, they'll go later. If we're having a drier year, maybe they'll go out earlier. So both of them do a rotation. Let's say they both do 1.5 rotations. Now I get rid of the disposable herd. Now the cow herd gets to finish grazing their rotation, and then when they're done they can move over and finish the other herd's rotation. Okay, so I can get a lot later into the fall by using this disposable herd. You could do the same thing with a hay bind, right? You cut part of it, and then you move the cows onto that regrowth later on. So different ways of doing that. But that whole time we're out there, we're recycling that nutrients. We're using those ruminant animals to break down that material and put it back to the soil. Okay, the urine is soaking in, even in frozen ground, it is hitting there and freezing. It's not necessarily volatilizing off. And then when it thaws in the spring, it just kind of soaks down. We're losing a lot less that way. But having those animals out there in the fall, we're setting it up. We're dropping biology out that's setting everything up so that in the springtime, it's going to kick back into gear. Now, also this time of the year, maybe the top of the plants are, look like they're dead, but we still have biological action happening underground. Okay, right now outside, if I went out there, dug down, we only have maybe an inch of frost. So there's still activity around those roots by the biology. It might be a lot slower, but it's still there. And we're middle of December, almost, the shortest day of the year. And I guarantee you there's still biological action out there. So if I can get animals out there dropping manure, dropping biology, that's going to trigger things for next spring just to be in that much better shape. Okay, so we can do a lot in the fall. Another way that I, have grazed in the fall before too is if I've been given a piece of land late in the season. Once in a while I've planned this on my own, but usually it's just because I get land late. I'll let it go, let it grow all season long. We get that one big root penetration. Not as good at building soil, but really good at building water holding capacity, because now we got all this dead matter on top. Then I'll kick animals out there in the fall or early winter and make them knock it down. Now it's not very good quality, right? It's low quality. I'll have to supplement, bring in some protein and maybe a little bit of energy of something, but they get to knock this down and recycle that back into the ground. And then we leave a lot of water holding or residue on top to build that soil armor. Okay. Now next year we can jump out there and kick it into gear and get the exudate going. We can't do any of this if we don't have water. Okay, the number one thing I got to get is water. So if I've got a new piece I'm taking over, I actually love doing this. I guess I could call it deferred grazing. You let it go, let it get mature, let it go to seed, leave the residue, knock it down with the cattle, and then the next year you kick in with some regenerative grazing. And probably one of the best and most economical ways of me to regenerate some pasture land. Okay, and that carries over to the spring too. We could stockpile this and use this in the spring. Same thing, we've got all that material out there. We kick the animals out early, might have to supplement a little bit, maybe fade them in as the grass starts growing underneath it. But yeah, same thing, we're gonna knock it down. We've got biology being added, stimulating for that early spring growth. So stockpile grazing is fantastic as well. You can either graze it in the fall and winter or save it till the spring. So what about winter? How do we build soil in the winter? Well, one way that I've done it is with bale grazing. Now, there's lots of arguments. Every environment's different. I'm not saying that this will work for you or it doesn't work for you. In any of the things that I'm talking about here today, it's an idea, right? You need to take the idea and adapt it to your environment, because I know you're in a different environment than me, but maybe this will work, maybe it won't. But by bale grazing out there, everybody's talking, the benefit is all the extra fertility. Okay, we're adding all this fertility out there, but the problem is fertility gets used up if you don't create a system that can make its own fertility. Okay, the big benefit for me from bale grazing is actually the water holding capacity. I can take a terrible pasture that has no soil armor, no water holding capacity hardly at all, and I can bale graze across it, and I want to leave that residue. Everybody's worried about waste from bale grazing. Oh, that's what I want. I want some waste, right? I want 10 to 15, maybe 20% waste out there on purpose, because that is a water, builds that soil armor up quick. The next year we've got water holding capacity. It can be a drought and we still have growth. I've actually done the experiment a couple times, one slide ahead of myself. A couple of different ways that we've bale grazed before. So you can put all the bales out there in the fall, take all the twines off, and then we just move an electric fence down the rows and ration off. I like 4 to 5 days worth of bales at a time. It's a nice balance between how much they clean up and how well they clean up versus their nutrition, and make sure everybody gets a bunk space so everybody can eat. We don't end up with these skinny cows at the end, because when you first move them in there on day one of a 4 or 5 day graze period, everybody's got a bale. Everybody's standing in a bale. There's nobody that's pushed off to the side. By day 4 and 5, everybody's cleaning up. Everybody's scrounging pretty hard then, but we get a more even nutrition for them too. So the other way that I've done this before is if I've got somebody close by that I'm buying hay from, well, I'll get them to deliver it for me, but I'll do it throughout the winter. I never touch a bale, right? He brings the hay over. He puts one load in this paddock and one load in that paddock and one load in the other paddock, and however many paddocks I've got close by, I just have to go out and cut the twine off, and then I open gates just like summer grazing. I just start grazing these pastures, and when I'm done, get down to my last paddock, I phone him up and say, okay, you can fill them up again, and then he'll just come out, bring in another load to each paddock. He'll just put the bales a little bit further each time, right? You'll be able to see where they were, so you go a little bit further, and he works his way across the paddock. Man, if I can set this up, this is no brainer, right? I've got very little labor. Don't even have to start a piece of equipment if I've got it set up right. And he's doing all the work, and the delivery price is included in he sets them up in the same price. I can hire a semi to bring them in for me. So I love that. I've had my yardage rate lower than, under 5 cents per head per day by bale grazing this way. So there's always a decision here: bale grazing or bale unrolling. There's always a debate, lots of debates on social media right now anyway about that. I've done this experiment. I've done it 3 times, 3 different years, 3 different experiments. So I've got a paddock that I bale graze on, and right beside it, I've got a paddock that I unroll bales.
What?
Bale unrolling does pretty well for the first couple of years, but we're adding nutrients to the bale unrolling. Okay, not to mention it takes a lot more labor and equipment costs to unroll bales. Now I've had bale trucks forever. Don't take me wrong. I like my bale truck and I like unrolling bales. But if I add in the labor and equipment cost to it, and then I look at the future potential of my pasture, bale grazing is won every time. Bale unrolling costs more, and then they eat too much of it. I know this is totally against your frame of thought here, but they eat too much of the feed. With the bale grazing, I get some waste, and I start getting that water holding capacity. Start building that soil structure going. With bale unrolling, they eat too much of it. We just get fertility added, and then we get that nutrients gets used up over the next couple of years, and then it's gone. Okay, and then we don't have the water holding capacity added, and it just disappears. Whereas the bale grazing, we start building a system, we get that soil armor, we start building biology, and they start making their own fertility, and it'll go on for years and years and years. So I'm more of a fan of bale grazing than bale unrolling. That being said, I've unrolled a lot of bales in my day. So I've wore out probably 6 bale trucks now. Yeah, used a lot of bale trucks. So in the wintertime, let's talk about crops now a little bit. Life is better with cows around. If you're a crop farmer, you've got to get some livestock out there. And the advantage is you don't even have to own the animals. There's a lot of people out there that love managing cows. There's a lot of young farmers that would love to come in and manage your, a herd of animals on your land. You don't have to own them. You don't have to manage them. I know of multiple people who bring in somebody else's cattle to graze on their grain land. I happen to be one of the ones that brings the cattle in, and I work with a grain farmer in that aspect. So lots of different ways to do this. I have done quite a few things. We've done crop residue grazing, we've done swath grazing, intercropping, tried lots of different ways. Now, we learn just as much from the failures as we do the successes. So I'm going to tell you about some failures as well today. But we've done quite a bit of this. I think the first time I was grazing on a grain field was in 2002, 2003 winter. So I've been doing this for a long time. Crop residue grazing. So that would be the residue out of the back of the combine. Whatever crop it is, you've got straw and chaff coming out, and we come in with cattle and we start trying to recycle that nutrients back onto the grain land. And I think that's very important, because if you're not recycling it through a ruminant, it's going to volatilize off. It's going to, weather and disappear. It's not going to get recycled back to the land. To begin with, you exported all the grain off the land, right? There's a good chunk of it that's disappearing, and then what little we did save, it's weathering and volatilizing off. So we need to have those livestock out there to recycle it, put it in a more stable form to stay with the ground. So this was a pea straw field many years ago. You can see the regrowth in between the swaths there. They combined this, and then we got to go out and fence it and graze it. Now, all that green in between is little baby pea plants. I mean, that was a fantastic crop. We didn't have to supplement on this at all. You'd move the fence, they'd go out and start grazing between the swaths before they hit the swaths. But this year, we were always leaving it just out of the back of the combine, turn the chopper off. And this particular year, it was so wet that it kept making these little piles. Every time the combine had to stop because it was plugging up, right, it would make this pile that's stuck in behind. And I went digging through those piles. I noticed the cows were always going to the piles first. So I started digging into those piles, and it was a mixed layer of straw and chaff and straw and chaff and straw and chaff. So they were getting all this, the good stuff out of there. Now, if it's just coming out of the back of the combine, this chaff comes out underneath on the traditional combines anyway, and then the straw comes out on top. So the chaff ends up on the bottom and, goes through the stubble and ends up right on the ground and is hard to get. Whereas if you can mix them in these piles, boy, it's a nice mix in there and a lot better for them. So I was thinking, how do we make these little piles across the field? And then a fella in southern Alberta, he invented the chaff buncher, and it makes these little piles across the field. Not that one, right there, that one. That's a chaff buncher. So everything comes out the back of the combine and collects on this, and then it tips. And then as you're driving forward, the stubble will pull that off and leave these piles across the field. Okay, so piles like this. Now, the one year we did pea straw residue, this field here that we're looking at, it wouldn't pull off that chaff buncher. There wasn't enough stubble, and then the peas were clingy, so they were still hanging up on the peas in the combine as they were coming out. So that's when we invented this blue buncher, we called it. My daughter called that. It was just in 6 hours in the shop, we welded this thing together, and it just rotates backwards and it collects. You can see as you come out of the combine there, it would collect on the top side of that and it would rotate. And then as it flips over, it dumps a pile and starts collecting on the other side, and it just keeps rotating. So it left piles all across the field. Okay, so that's a good way to graze. It's basically a free source. If you're a mixed cattle and grain farmer, this is honestly to me a no-brainer. But even if you're a grain farmer, you should get some livestock out there and get recycling it. And this is an effective way. If you get some deep snow, they can still get through it. I've gone through probably 2 feet of snow. With these piles, you can get through deeper snow than with just swaths. So the piles work quite well. We've done swath grazing before. so this is where we take an entire crop. So either it is a salvage crop, maybe they had a poor year, or over the years I've had quite a few farmers who seeds specific crops just for me, right? That's their whole purpose, is they want me to harvest it. Last winter we harvested one, and the grain farmer came to me after, and he said that basically he made more money off my cows than he would have if he would have combined that field. So it was a pretty good crop, and the cows did really well on it. Okay. But now we're recycling, we're trying to build soil, getting that nutrients, that biology back out onto that grain land, I think is really important. Okay. So just some examples. There's a couple of different kinds of animals out there. There's the diggers and there's the cleanup crew. So diggers are the ones that are aggressive and go down and dig through that snow. Cleanup crew, they end up being the skinnies. They kind of hang out in the back and eat what's left over. And there's also opportunists. They kind of hang out beside the diggers, and when the digger comes up with a mouthful, they'll steal it out of their mouth. It's kind of funny to watch them. So here's an opportunity. There's a digger. She digs it, she pulls it up, and 34 is an opportunist. I love that one. So yeah, swath grazing is a good option out here. Now, if you don't have frozen ground, I've had a few years where we get some real warm winters, and yeah, they can do a lot of damage out there. So you have to have a plan B. Okay, a lot of people get hooked on this. Well, if you're going to bale graze or if you're going to swath graze, well, it won't work here because our land isn't frozen all the time. Well, how many weeks out of the winter is your land frozen on average? Well, plan that many. If the ground's frozen, you can be out swath grazing. If it warms up, pull them off and put them in a feed, in your feed area. When it freezes again, put them back out on it. Okay. I'm not saying you have to do it all winter, right? You don't have to do any of this in one order. You can have a combination of things, right? Lots of times I'll have a bale grazing, set up next to a swath grazing. If it gets too cold or it gets too muddy, well, I'll move them over into the bale grazing for a little while. And then when it freezes or the maybe it's not as cold anymore, we'll kick them back out onto the swath grazing. So I always try and have a backup, right? You don't have to do one thing only. So that's what, if someone's going to try something new, that's what they think, that's the only thing they can do. No, you can have a plan B. Just some random pictures here for different fields. So I've been working with a grain farmer for, like I said, since 2002. First time I swath grazed one of his fields, it was a barley field that was very poor. I think they had a drought that year, so we had some that germinated early, and then it had basically gone to mature. And then we had another batch of that barley that germinated in July, so we had a bunch of green stuff up there too. So we went out there and we swath grazed that winter. That was the first time that we made it right through the winter. And I learned that winter really quickly that you don't want to be on a zero-till grain farmer's field in April when spring breakup happens. Yeah, they did a lot of damage up there. We can learn those things, and we don't do that anymore. So we plan to not to graze year round if we're out here doing swath grazing. So, but now this is actually the same farmer that I'm still working with, and 2 years ago, or 2 or 3 years ago now, 3 years ago now, he called me up and he said he wants to work with me. He wants me to rent part of his land. I mean, that's quite a time span in between there, but he went to a couple of grazing conferences, and his son is now part of the operation as well, and he's starting to see this regenerative agriculture thing as almost a must, that we have to do it or else we're going down this spiral. So he wants cows on his grain land. So I'm like, you bet, let's do this. So that little green piece right here, that's the pasture that he gave me. It's a bunch of low land, and half the time you can't combine it or you can't seed it, it's too wet. So he gave that piece to me. Ideally, it'd be nice to be right in the middle, but this is the piece that I got. So I got 100 acres there. Not a very big piece, right? Not really worth it for me to go over with a herd of cattle, but because we're working with him for so long, and we've got all this other land to work with as well, it was worth it. So I set that up as a pasture, and now we graze that. So we've worked with him on that. We also did this 155 acre field. We did pea straw residue there a few years ago. That was some of the pictures that you saw. So now I have that quarter fenced as well. And so we were out there in the winter, and we were trying to get some stimulation on his soil, the biology adding up, building that.
Okay, this 185 acres, last year we fenced it, and it was touching my pasture now, so I had a water system there already. We actually implemented a winter water system there now as well. So we swath grazed that, and that was the field that he said he did better than if he, would have combined it. So he was very happy with that, and moved that. And now he's fairly excited about this. We now get this 140 acres across the road as a graze fallow. So you might not have heard the term graze fallow before. If in the olden days we used to summer fallow everything, right? You would give your land a break, right? That was the idea behind the summer fallow. We'd give it a break and a rest for a year, and they would cultivate and till the heck out of it. In my mind, not a very good break for that land. But we're going to rest this land, but we're going to graze it as a rest. So it's going to pull out of his rotation, or I should say it's part of his rotation now. We're going to get it for, I believe, 4 years is what we've talked about. So he's actually seeded it down. He seeded it this fall. He put in winter wheat. So that's the first thing we get to graze in the spring. And then in the spring, he's also going to seed down a cover crop in there as well. So the winter wheat's going to come out. He's going to have that living root. He had the living root in the ground this fall. He's also going to have it really early in the spring. So he's capitalizing on that sunlight capturing and the soil building early and late in the fall and early in the spring. And then we're going to graze it. He's going to seed that cover crop. We're going to graze it, knock down the winter wheat, and then the cover crop's going to come up. The advantage here is we're going to also graze the same herd with this pasture. We did build a alleyway all the way basically from this corner of this pasture all the way around. This is actually a railway track running through here. So we ran all the way down the railway track beside it, and we can get over to this part. So we're going to graze one herd on this green pasture part and the orange cover or graze fallow part. And so yeah, we're going to set that up, and we're going to graze that for 4 years. We're actually going to keep its study through the Gateway Research Organization. We're going to keep a chunk of that, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 acres, that he's going to continue to grain farm. And we've got soil samples. We're going to see the difference after 4 years between the two pieces of land, how much benefit this graze fallow does to his land. And of course, he's going to make money on that land while we're grazing it. So pretty excited about that. We've also done some intercropping. This field as well. This year we did try to do an intercropping experiment with the Gateway Research Organization as well. Basically, we were trying to see, how to plant a polyculture out there, but also still get a crop to harvest of that. So he used wheat. I think it might have, originally we were planting barley, but he switched to wheat. And we had four experiments. Basically, one was basic straight monoculture. That's our control. And then beside it, we had an area that was wheat plus 3 other species. So it was a 4 species polyculture. And then beside it, we had an 8 species polyculture. So wheat plus 7 other species. And then beside that, we had 16. So wheat plus 15. And the idea was to try and see if this polyculture will change the biology in the soil. And at what point maybe we don't need to add any fertility at all. Because with regenerative agriculture, if we can get a polyculture of plants, that gives us a polyculture of root systems, which gives us a polyculture of soil biology. And that biology will get us the fertility for free. So that was our experiment. Now, I told you before, some things don't always work. Another year, 2 in a row now, where we've been absolutely flooded. We got more rain than we've, in the last 2 years than we have in the last 10. And a lot of these fields just flooded out. I know neighbors are talking about pea fields where they're planting pea crops, that the seeds basically just rotted in the ground. They didn't germinate because it was too wet. They just rotted. So we had some come up, not great. The wheat did okay. The wheat did well. So what he did was he actually seeded the wheat first, let it germinate, and then he sprayed it out for weeds, a typical grain or crop mentality there. But he wanted a nice clean field, and then he went in between with his test and seeded this cover crops in between. So I like the idea of it. For me as the grazer too, then that wheat is mature and gets combined off. Then everything in the fall that's growing up, he has that living root in the soil growing in the fall, but it's not as mature, right? So it's better grazing potential for me when I come in the fall. So that was our plan, that was our idea, but because it all flooded out, we had some growth of that cover crop, but not enough it wasn't worth it for me to take cattle over. They wouldn't have been there long enough. Now, so he didn't get any extra revenue off of it, but he still had that living root in the soil late in the fall. We actually had a better cover crop of flax out there, his volunteer flax, than he actually had of the cover crop that he seeded, just the way it worked that year. So sometimes it doesn't always work, but that's why we do experiments, to try and figure out how to make it work right. So there's a couple more pieces of land here that we're going to work with over the next few years. He wants to try and get some livestock on all this land. Okay, so it's recycling nutrients, it's building biology. We're trying to build up this soil, and we can do it year round. We don't have to just do that in the summertime. Now, the downside to this growing soil on a crop situation is that plant is seeded later in the spring than my perennials. It grows once and then it matures early, and then it's combined off or harvested off, and then the land sits. So of that 4.5 months I talked about earlier, how much of that 4.5 months are we actually building soil? Okay, with this, we've got, that winter wheat in that field. It was growing last fall. It's going to be growing early in the spring. The cover crop's going to come in and create a polyculture. We're going to get increased biology. It's going to grow late into the season. Okay, with that intercrop, we're going to have that late growth coming up right up until that killing frost that's still putting exudate into the ground. Okay, so we're trying to extend that as long as possible. Then we bring the cows in to recycle it and bring the biology in over the winter, so that in the spring everything's ready to kickstart forward and be ready to grow. So to me, that's the exciting part about this, is I'm working with a grain farmer, and he understands the idea of this regenerative, of bringing in the biology and get these livestock out there. So really excited to be working with him, and I'm pretty glad that we're onto this. So we can ask some questions about this after. So cover crops, I talked a little bit about it. Now, the issue I've had in the past is a lot of people will ask me why I don't like cover crops. So I guess I've done some criticisms on cover crops in the past, and I just like to set the record straight here. Honestly, I think we got too many salesmen out here selling cover crops now. It's the new latest and greatest magic bullet that's coming out that everybody's got to do. So here's my take on cover crops. I like them. They're a huge step forward in a grain operation or a cropping operation. Okay, if we go from a monoculture and we put in this polyculture, just a whole bunch of those concepts that I just talked about, it does a wonderful job. It's so much better than that monoculture. Building soil, building biology, the more species you get out there, the better. Okay. The problem I have with a cover crop is it's a step backwards in my operation. Okay. If I'm going from a perennial polyculture, there's nothing that grows soil faster and better than a well-managed perennial polyculture. Okay, it can't compete because it's growing early in the spring, it's growing right till the fall, it's got a polyculture already, it's already established, it's got good cover, we're not breaking up that thatch layer at all. Yeah, if I take over a piece of grain land, it's going into a perennial because there's nothing that builds soil faster. So, but if you're in the cropping industry and you're wanting to stay in that and use cover crops, excellent step forward in a cropping operation. But the problem is we've got too many salesmen telling people to rip up your hay fields and rip up your pastures and put in cover crops. Okay, I disagree with that 100%. We need to keep that water holding capacity. We need to keep that ground covered. If you've already got a perennial, get some cattle on it, get some livestock on there, and start building that system, because your cover crop is a step backwards from my point of view. So that's my take on it. I'm not against cover crops by any means. In a cropping operation, it's a huge step forward. Okay, so yeah, one of my favorite quotes, Gabe Brown said, "Nothing builds soil faster than a well-managed perennial polyculture." Everybody misses that in his presentations, though. Everybody overlooks that slide, and that's my favorite slide in his presentation. So how do I do this? I've done quite a few cover crops over the time, but like I said, I'm trying to, if I take over grain land, I will establish a cover crop in order to get a perennial pasture on the way. That's my goal, and I'm really cheap about it. I've done some real cheap ways, and I've tried some expensive ways, so I'll explain that. This is just a quad-mounted broadcaster, really simple, really easy, not very accurate. supposed to mount on the rack of the quad. I'd advise you to put it on the front rack, not the back rack, because when it stops working, it plugs up or something. You'll feel it because it's not hitting you on the face anymore. You got to wear sunglasses, but yeah, put it on the front of the rack. I cheat, and I actually put it on the back of the truck, because the problem was it's pretty small. You kept running out of seed, and you always had to run back to the truck anyway. So this way, the seed's in the truck, and it's easy to fill up and put on there. Now, ideally, you put someone on the back to keep it filled, and you drive and you spread seed. Doesn't matter how accurate you are. It doesn't matter if you miss a spot, because this is going to be a perennial. I'm not worried about even germination. I'm not, cattle don't care if there's a gap. So I'm not very fussy about that. I love it when the neighbors complain that I missed a spot. That's fantastic, because then I have another whole different type of edge created, because I've got one type of crop here, and then I've got an edge in the middle and another one over here, and I've got different edges. That increases my biology. So looking at it from an aerial photo, here's one of the fields we did. Okay, you can see we didn't quite drive straight, and we tried to miss a gap right in the middle there, right where the blue dot is, that whole area that we were trying to keep it a little straighter than that, but we didn't seed anything in there just to see a comparison. So we tried a few different examples back and forth, but like I said, I'm not very concerned about how accurate I am. But you know what, you might think that's kind of Mickey Mouse, or not very professional, but then we turned the cattle out. We did it right before a rainfall. We timed this because we have a bunch of pasture around this land. It was easy to time it. Broadcast that seed out here. Then we turned I think it was 300 bred heifers out on it, and we grazed it for 2 or 3 days. Basically, they were eating volunteer canola. This was the remnants of the canola coming up in the spring. They were a little runny, yes, they were, but we stepped all that into the ground. I know a bunch of the larger seeds, we actually seeded the small seeds once in one pass, and then we had to put the big seeds in again, because they didn't fall through the spreader very similarly. So I did notice a whole bunch of birds out there for the next 2 days. So I think a bunch of my sunflowers and my barley and my oats got picked away pretty good by the birds. So we didn't have much sunflower out there as I was hoping. So we basically broadcast and trampled this, and then we waited. This was done in June 5th. We waited 3 months, and we turned the cattle back out. That's what my crop looked like. Okay, we had a good rainfall year that year, obviously, but we put in a 21 species mix, absolutely no fertilizer. So where did the fertility come from? Okay, because we had cattle out there, we've got some biology going that stimulates the soil biology, and those 21 different root systems stimulate some biology, and we had a fantastic crop. Okay, we had C4 plants, we had C3 plants, we had perennials, we had annuals, we had legumes, we had creeping legumes, we had taprooted legumes, we had bunch grasses, we had creeping grasses, you name it, we had them out there. We had biannuals, a little bit of everything out there, and that's what came up. Fantastic crop. Year 2, now we got the sweet clover kicking in, right? We have another species. Now our perennials are starting to come in more than our annuals, and another beautiful crop on year 2. Absolutely no fertility added. All we did was broadcast seed, and we trampled it in with the cattle. So yeah, anybody say I hate cover crops? No, I love cover crops. But in a grain situation, we've got that cropland. This is a beautiful thing to transition this into a polyculture. Another spot of the field in year 2. We got our perennials coming in, our clovers are coming in nice and thick. Just a beautiful crop. Okay. Other ways I've seeded in the past, we've got this Valmar that I've used. We can rent it from our Applied Research Association for like $2 an acre or something. It's like super reasonable. If I want to be a little bit more accurate, we can zip across the field with that pretty easy. And yeah, it does a pretty good job. I've used, one of my friends has a drill like this. I think it's a John Deere 750 zero-till drill. I've done this before. 2015, we got this rented, got a neighbor with a tractor over there. We bought all the seed and we seeded into a pasture. I purposely overgrazed the pasture in the spring. I wanted to set back the existing stand and then put in this, basically a perennial cover crop, right? Just put in a whole bunch of different seeds to try and get a polyculture in there. Worked great, right? This machine went over my pasture and you could hardly tell it was there. It dug in nice. we had a beautiful germination. I did it right after a rainstorm. So we had nice, wet, moist soil in there, and I kept the cattle out there even longer, right? After we seeded it, the cattle were still out there for about 5 days. So just before these seedlings started to come out, I pulled the cattle out. So I really set back the existing stand. Like, they seriously overgrazed it. Had a beautiful catch. I had all these little seedlings coming out, and we didn't get another drop of rain for about 3 months. So guess what happens? I purposely overgrazed it, took all the residue. It was a poor field to begin with, so we had a lot of evaporation. All these little seedlings that came up, they basically yellowed off and died. And because of the lack of moisture that year, this was a failure. If we would have got the rain, I guarantee it would have been a success. So if you tell me which year you're going to get rain, I'll tell you which years you're going to be successful. Pretty simple that way. But so we put some extra money into this one, and it didn't work because we didn't get the moisture. Now the broadcasting one, the other year, we put hardly anything into it. We got the rain, and we had a huge success. So again, what's the most important nutrient we manage on our land? Water by far. So basically I lost money on this one, and it didn't work. And because I had overgrazed that pasture on a drought year, I set it back probably 3 years, right? So I had to really baby this one for 3 years and try and get it back to what it was originally. So we've got some risk with that. If we, try some of this stuff on a drought year, then we can have some trouble. So I've also hired this one. This is the unit that the grain farmer that I work with has. He's got a zero-till disc seeder like here. I zoom in on the discs a little bit. Very slick. All GPS controlled. Man, it's a little too complicated for me to operate, but he's got it under control. And this one was the opposite year. I spent a bunch of money. I basically hired him to go seed it for me. I think it was $2,500 to seed it, plus the seed, another, I don't know, $1,500 for seed I think I put in, and we flooded. So everything we ended up, we were out there grazing on this after we seeded it. It came up pretty good, and then it flooded out, and we were grazing through 11 inches of water. So again, I put a whole bunch of money into seeding it down, and we had a extreme year, and it kind of failed. If I would have broadcast seed out there, I wouldn't have had as much risk in it, right? Broadcast and trample is one of my favorite ways of regenerating land, to seed it, and that's probably the one I'm going to stick with the most. I'll try this again just as an experiment, but yeah, when I put money into seeding, I end up usually having an extreme year and it doesn't work. So on a good year, you bet it would work great. So year-round soil building, I think that is a new direction that we need to look, right? It's a new mindset that we need to focus on not just on grazing operations, but also cropping operations. How can we build soil as much, 365 days a year? I think that's important. So this is my last slides, shameless plug. If anybody wants to buy a book, this is a real easy one. If you want to know what it's about, I would say it's very blunt. It's short and sweet and to the point. It doesn't take you very long to read it, and that's what I would say. It's blunt. So, and that's what I have for you today. I wanted to leave lots of time for question and answers, so I hope we did that. I think we got about a half an hour left, so let's do that.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Steve. I'll just pull my screen back here.
You can take it back. I don't have to give it back.
I get to take it back. That's right.
Okay, good.
All right, so put myself back up here. So now we'll pull up the questions here of what we can have, and I've had a few people asking some questions here, so I'll pull those out. Get that going. So had was, do you allocate the area for grazing on the basis of herd direct dry matter requirement? If so, how do you determine how much dry matter requirement is in your pastures at a point in time?
So basically measuring yield, basically asking me how much yield we're getting out there and how much we're grazing. Now, everybody measures that differently. Some people measure the amount of dry matter out there, some animal days per acre, stock days per acre, animal unit months. I actually use animal days per acre is how I record or measure how much yield I'm getting off my land. So as long as you're comparing your numbers to your numbers every year, it doesn't matter which method you use, as long as you've got some way of managing that. So I don't see the questions here. Is there a spot I can find them?
So if people, you can either write your questions, there's a question section or in the chat section. So I can see the questions in the question section. Unfortunately, Steve can't. So if you want Steve to see your questions, write them in the chat section. And then the ones that are in the question section, I see those.
You can ask. Okay. Okay,
So,
I was wondering. I was trying to look.
Another question I have here. Yeah. Yeah. Another question that I can ask here is, I'm wondering, in year one of the cover crop, how long did you leave the cattle on the cover crop?
That cover crop, we seeded it on June 5th, and I believe we came back to graze it at the end of August. So, and that wasn't necessarily what I was trying to do. I would have liked to have been back there a little bit earlier, but just in that rotation that year with the number of cattle we had, that's when we got back. It was getting almost too mature to be out there, but not a bad thing on the first year, because then we knock a bunch of it down and create that water holding capacity for the years following. So.
More questions here. Wouldn't the success of bale grazing also be from the added nutrients that are coming into the farm from outside sources, being the hay bales? You're basically substituting synthetic fertilizer with imported hay bales, aren't you?
Yes, like I said, even if you're unrolling bales or bale grazing, you're bringing in nutrients. And you bet, I love it, because if people are exporting their nutrients, I'll gladly bring it in. However, the difference I was explaining was between the unrolling and the bale grazing is the unrolling, you're not going to improve the water holding capacity as fast. And to me, that's the important part. The nutrients will get used up and it'll be gone after a few years. But if we can build up that water holding capacity, that's the #1 nutrient that I'm managing. Yeah, the bonus for the first couple of years is all the, the urine and the manure and the hay residue left. Yes, we're going to get nutrients out of that, fertility, but it's the water holding capacity that I really want.
Yep. Another. In essence, you are really managing for drought.
Always.
So that's not really a question,
Every day.
Tim.
Every day I'm managing for a drought. Even on my best years, the best year you have is the best year to be managing for a drought. It's the easiest, right? The last 2 years, I've left loads of residue, more residue than I ever have before, because we've had these two really wet years. Because it's a lot easier to do it now than it is in a drought, right? If you're managing for a drought in a drought, you're way too late.
How do you move your cows around from place to place? So how are you managing that?
So we will have, for example, last summer or this past summer, we had 7 different herds on 4 different locations. Okay, so, but one herd will arrive at one pasture and it'll stay there for the whole season. And then we just rotate them around within there. We don't have to haul them anywhere or move them. And then they just get shipped out of there. They're gone. There's a couple of places where we do a cattle drive down the road, just because one piece of land is not touching. But yeah, we don't haul animals around with a stock trailer or anything. But once they come into that field, they're there for the summer, and then they get shipped out in the fall.
And I guess to kind of go along with that, another question similar: how are you watering your cattle in your winter system?
The winter system, we've got a couple of different ways of doing that. The one that I described on that grain field, we actually have a solar system there out of a wet well. We hooked it up with a motion sensor. They call it a motion sensor, but it's actually a heat detection. So basically, when the cattle walk up to it, a wet well is a culvert that's dug down that's connected to a water body or a dugout, and the water will move in between them through through the water line. And then when the animals walk up to the culvert, there's a special bowl in the top, and the motion sensor will trigger it and it'll turn the pump on. It'll come up and fill the bowl, they can drink. And then when they walk away, the motion sensor will shut everything off and everything will drain back down the culvert and back where it won't freeze. So that's the system we have there. But in a lot of other locations, we end up with using a generator or a power source of some kind to rig up a continuous flow, where basically the water gets pumped and it continuously pumps and drains back into the water source. So it just cycles the water. It's a lot cheaper to pump water than it is to heat water. If anybody wants more on that, definitely go to my Facebook page. We've got a water system album in the photos, and I've got a description of how it will do it and a bunch of pictures of all the different water systems that we do. So that's a good source for water systems.
Awesome. Just a question coming back about the hay grazing. At some point, is the price of hay too great a cost to bale graze or unroll? Say if the hay was 8 cents a pound or more.
That's a good question, and it comes up a lot. If I was actually to do a full study, I would like to do the study on also the next 10 years of growth you get from that. Okay, so yes, that's a concern when the price of hay gets up at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 cents a pound. You know, to me, it's still a no-brainer. Bale grazing is better. Once it gets a little bit higher, well, I might shorten up my graze period on my bale grazing to make them clean up a little bit better. But if you want to weigh out the production increase over the next 10 years, yeah, it's still, you know, bale grazing is still, even at 10 cents a pound, I think it's still a better way to do it. Also include in your labor costs, right? When I break that down, I can send you a few articles that describe this better than I'm going to right now. If you break down your labor and equipment costs separate from your feeding costs, your feed costs, or the amount of waste that's out there. In a lot of examples, I've shown it where my labor and equipment costs are, let's say they're 75 cents per head per day, but my waste cost, even at 10 cents a pound for hay, ends up only being 60 cents versus the labor cost of 75 cents. So until that labor and equipment cost gets lower than what your waste is, bale grazing is still a better means of doing it. Now, there's other reasons why you would or wouldn't bale graze too, but that's just on the economic side of it. So we've got to balance out that labor and equipment cost versus the how much material is wasted, plus the benefit of all that water holding capacity and fertility for the next 10 years.
Kind of going along with that, how do you time it right that you sway the cover crop so that it doesn't rot in the windrow before it freezes up, so you can swept graze quality forage?
Only once in 20 years have I had mold on my swaths. Now, we might be in a different environment. I know Ontario has a lot more moisture and a lot more humidity out there. If we've got a cereal crop or mostly a cereal crop out there, we can swath it properly, and the way the swather interconnects that crop, it sheds the rain really well. The only time I had mold on it was actually because we got snow really early, which protected it, but our ground hadn't froze yet. We had about a foot and a half of snow, but it was still mud underneath. And because the ground was warm and the snow was above it, the swaths started to mold a little bit. I didn't have any issues with it. I was watching it. I was concerned about it, but we didn't have any issues. So in our environment, yeah, we don't get a lot of that mold. Like, we'll get some rain in the fall, but usually not enough to make it an issue. Now, out in Ontario, maybe you will. Maybe that's, you can't do that for the whole winter, or that fall part maybe won't work quite as well, but it hasn't been a problem for me.
This might be an interesting question for you. How would you recommend establishing a perennial polyculture when you don't already have cattle? It's from somebody who's just kind of starting out and trying to get it established and doesn't quite have the cattle yet.
Okay, there's quite a few situations I've heard over the years where you just ask somebody, go to somebody with cattle and say, do you want let's work a deal together. If anybody wants a really good example of that, Brendan Rocky is a potato farmer out of Colorado, and we just had a coffee shop talk with him on our Facebook page. But there's also a presentation of his that's online, that's available through the Western Canadian Grazing Conference. You can go to that site and look it up, and you can see his whole presentation. That's an incredible one. He's a potato farmer, and he basically calls himself a biotic farmer, not an antibiotic farmer. He doesn't want anything to do with cows, but he knows how important they are for his land. So he's worked a deal out with his neighbor who brings cattle over, and he basically does a graze follow, like I kind of explained. He's got a 2-crop rotation on his operation. He does 1 crop of potatoes that's actually a polyculture. There's actually, I think, 6 other species growing with his potatoes. And his alternate year is a cover crop that his neighbor grazes. So his cattle come in and do the grazing, and everything's under irrigation, different environment, but it's, perfectly, regenerative. Like it's an amazing presentation that he has. I highly recommend everybody to look at it. But he just went to a neighbor and said, hey, I need cows, right? If I grow this crop, can you come graze it? And they worked out a deal, and both sides are happy with it, and he's getting some really good benefits out of those cattle recycling that cover crop. So I'm not sure what the question was anymore, but I hope I answered it.
And you know what, just to kind of go along with this, and following up on some of the cover crop webinars that we did in partnership with OMA and sheep farmers, do you have any advice to kind of give to people who are potentially looking for partnerships with their neighbors and their other crop farmers but nearby, of what you've done with your neighbors and establishing the partnerships that you've potentially done? Any like go-to tips or things not to do, or things when you're trying to kind of establish those partnerships?
I've said for years now that the most important part of my business is human resources, right? Trying to make those connections, trying to make those building trust with people that I work with, and that's where it comes down to. For every 100 grain farmers I talk to, I got one that'll work with me, right? If they're a big enough operation to, for me to bring a herd over to, and they don't already have cows, well, chances are they don't like cows and they don't want cows. So, cows are the last thing on their mind in my environment. So that is a hard discussion to have. I've done it numerous times, and yeah, it doesn't work out very well usually. But you're trying to, we've got to get some of those crop farmers who aren't stuck in that modern agriculture way of thinking. We've got to, and it's growing. Regenerative agriculture is growing. Last year, our regenerative grazing conference was sold out before the early bird deadline, right? It's growing. We've got a lot more people coming into this. We've got a lot more of the crop farmers that are starting to say, hey, something's not right here. Maybe we got to look in another direction. So we are growing, and I think it's getting a little bit easier to have those conversations. But boy, yeah, 20 years ago, I just about had rocks thrown at me when I suggested putting cows on their land. So,
have you calculated a dollar value of bale grazing to your farming enterprise, including that value to your enterprise of recycling up to 20% of those bales into the soil?
Yes, not recently though. For many, many years, I've used a value of 30 cents per head per day for any hay that I've fed on my land, imported hay. Okay, so that's just a value of the nutrients. I actually did that many years ago. I took the value of the NKP&S that comes out the back end of a cow and put a dollar value that and converted it. I can't remember the calculations anymore, but came out with 30 cents per dry cow per day. So it's got to be imported feed, because if I'm making the hay myself and I'm feeding it on my land, all I'm doing is moving nutrients around. I'm not actually importing it. So if I'm buying feed, then I put that 30 cents to value. Now, that was 15, 20 years ago, so maybe my value should be raised because, the value of nutrients is higher now, but I'm not getting any extra benefit out of it. It's the same amount of growth I get from it, so I'm leaving it at 30 cents. Now, that doesn't account for any of the water holding capacity, right? Which I already said, that's the biggest reason I do it now. So that's my value. Don't know how accurate it is, but that's what I've been using for many years. The reason I came up with that was when I sold my herd of cows, right? When I first started learning how to do my economics, I figured out that my gross margin was a lot better on my custom grazing than it was on my cow herd. And I was doing pretty good with my cow herds. I had really good reproductive rates. I had good weaning weights. I had, you know, 0 death losses that year. I remember I had a few sets of twins, right? We were doing fantastic. But my margin on my custom grazing was way better. The reason it was way better was because I had to pay so much for my grazing, which was funny because it was my grazing, right? It took me a while to get my head wrapped around that. I'm like, how is this possible? My cows are losing money because I have to pay myself too much. And once you get your head wrapped around that, it makes perfect sense, because the opportunity cost, if I got rid of my cows, I could bring in more custom cattle that are making better money. So I had to charge my cows that to make it balance, and it basically made my cows losing money. So when I sold my cows off, I brought in more custom animals. I'm like, okay, now we're moving ahead. And I realized that now I'm not getting all that imported nutrients and water holding capacity, right? Because when I had my cow herd, I was feeding cows during the winter, and I'm bringing in all that nutrients and all that water holding capacity. So I had to figure out there's a value there somewhere. I shortchanged my cows because they were giving me a benefit that I couldn't put a dollar value on. So I came up with that 30 cents per head per day, which basically my custom grazing operation has to pay my cows, right? The cows buy the hay. Let's use easy numbers here. If the cows have to pay $1 per head per day for feed, in reality, they're only paying 70 cents because my custom grazing operation has to pay 30 cents because that's how much fertilizer value they get. Does that make sense? Did I delineate that correctly? So there's a value there that has to be transported across. So I was actually cheating my cows when I did that first calculation because I didn't have that value in there. So I think it's a real number. You guys can argue it if you want, but I believe there's that value in there.
What alternatives do you suggest for those of us that use Ivomec-like products for parasite control on our cattle?
I talked earlier about the riparian area management. Okay, to me, it's the whole system that's out of whack. Pretty hard to give that answer in one quick here, little John. But I've got a little blurb that I talk about. I can post it on my Facebook page after if you want. It's a whole system we're managing. We bring in those predators, and then those predators can deal with the parasites. Okay, there's kind of a threefold, you know, I don't want to use the word battle, but I'm trying to look for another word. I don't like battle, but 3 different prongs to that fork that we're after. One is genetics, right? We've selected animals that have been treated with parasite controls for many years, and now we don't have any resistance to it, because the ones that don't have resistance to it, well, we treat them and they don't need resistance, and then we select those genetics. So over the years, our genetics has been getting worse for parasites. If we stopped treating, we'd have a bunch that got really bad with parasites and then some that wouldn't get so bad. If we started selecting for those ones that wouldn't get so bad, our genetics would get better. Okay, so that's step number 1 is genetics. Our genetics just can't deal with it anymore. Number 2 is a good nutrition. If we can build up a proper diet for the animals, which a lot of the amendments and additives and even grain adding into our feed rations can change the rumen, can change our entire system of the ruminant animal, and then our hormonal system's not functioning properly. So the hormonal function, let's talk about external parasites for lice, for example. If our hormonal systems aren't working correctly, we're not secreting the oils from our skin. Like the cattle aren't that oil is not on their skin, and then it's a perfect environment for the parasite. Whereas if they are working properly, we've got lots of oily skin out there, then the parasite don't like it. So we're naturally knocking them off. So we change the diet, and it totally changes the whole immune system. Okay, so we can't fight them off. And a good rotation. So definitely with parasites, we get a good rotation through our grazing. We can break the parasite cycles. because they're not being reinfested. With our rotation, I might be grazing this field, on middle of May, but I don't come back around to it till the middle of June. Well, in that time, the parasites are gone. We've got the insects coming in to decompose our manure. The eggs that have been exported in the manure also get decomposed and are gone. By the time my cattle come around, they don't have to reinfest themselves. So we don't have a parasite problem. So again, we're in this downward spiral. You treat, it gets worse, we get more parasites. We treat again, it gets worse, we get more parasites. If we can break out of that downward spiral and start getting our whole system in balance, we don't need parasite treatments. We don't. It's just a system. So I do have a better explanation of that. I can post that later tonight.
Do you know how much less hay you feed per cow compared to other herds in your area that don't use as managed pasture?
Hard to say, in pounds, because I don't necessarily always feed a herd in the winter either. This winter, I don't have any animals for the winter. I'm managing 6 pigs right now, 12 pigs right now, and they go to the butcher in about a week. And then I'll have nothing to manage. But most winters I have cattle, but this winter I won't. How much hay? I would say, in comparison, easy way to explain that would be how much later I graze. Right, and now it depends on how many bales or how many pounds you're going to feed your herd. But I'm normally, on an average year, I'm grazing well into October and November at least. On a good year, I might be grazing in December still. Now that's utilizing that disposable herd in a way as well. So some of the herd will go away and then I get to graze with the rest of them. Whereas, on an average year here, boy, September's starting and people are starting to look at feeding already. Middle of September, they're probably at home already. So I'll get a month or two past them anyway. And then I'll probably start at least 2 to 3 weeks earlier than them in the spring as well. So I can get a lot more of a grazing season. So there's a difference between a growing season and a grazing season. Right? Most people out here anyway basically graze the same as their growing season. Right? As soon as it turns green, they turn their animals out. And as soon as the killing frost hits, they're out of grass. So their grazing season and their growing season are the same. Whereas with well-managed pastures, I can get a lot longer grazing season with a short growing season.
What is a typical cover crop mix?
Oh, a recipe. Everybody wants a recipe. I would like to have as many different root systems as possible. That's my answer for that. Yes, there's a lot of guys who will know, the certain species that'll bring up that nutrient because your soil's, lacking in that. My advantage is I'm creating a perennial polyculture, right? And I know my perennial polyculture will fix any imbalances that are in my soil. So I don't really care, I don't have to get a certain amount of calcium brought up in a certain year because that's my next crop I'm going to grow. So I'll put out as many as I can and as whatever I can find that's cheap. The more root systems I get out there, the different types of root systems, the better my biology is, and then my perennials will come in and fix anything anyway. So I don't worry about what they are. I just want different types of root systems out there, and that's what's going to heal my land.
And kind of going along with root systems on that, you were talking about earlier, you don't really mind kind of the weeds coming into your polyculture, that sort of thing. When you do get a weed that does overtake, or if it does ever overtake, how do you go about controlling that and kind of getting it under control again? What's your strategy on that?
Whoever asked that question, you got to go read my daughter's article. It's a very well written article by her, actually. So basically, if we're managing for those 5 grazing concepts that we talked about, you shouldn't have any species taking over an area, right? You wouldn't, the undesirables, there might be a few of them there, but they don't get the chance to take over an area. It's our management that's causing that, okay? Could be a soil problem that's causing it as well, but we should be able to knock that out with our management. So a good graze period, a good rest period, get your stock density high, get your animal impact out there stimulating the soil and knocking them down, and get that soil cover, right? Get that soil armor on there. If you manage for those concepts and you still have an issue, then, you know, after 3 years, it doesn't happen overnight, right? This isn't a quick fix. This is a long-term solution to a problem. The problem with, you know, the issue with modern agriculture is we're looking for quick fixes to symptoms. Okay, the weed is a symptom. The problem is it's being overgrazed, or there's another underlying problem that's there. We need to deal with the problem, not the symptom. So it takes some time, right? It takes a couple of years, but there isn't a weed I can't outgraze, right? If there's too much of something, then within a few years we'll have it under control just with good grazing management.
Well, that's actually my question, so I'll just have to go read your daughter's article now.
There you go. Awesome.
Yeah, that's good. Well, it is at 9 o'clock now, and our questions do seem to have been slowing down a little bit. So with that, I will hand it over to Dan to close us out a little bit. But on my behalf, I'd like to say thank you. So that was great. Thanks.
Awesome. No, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Dan, I'll pass
Beth,
it over to you.
Yep. You can hear me okay, Beth?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Steve, yeah, you've run us through a gamut of a whole lot of subjects here. You're a great philosopher and educator. We've had history, biology, chemistry, English. Because you used a phrase in there like when I roll out the hay, they eat too much. I've never heard that on my farm in my life. That they clean it up too well. I hate it when they leave stuff out there. But you've also done a talk on physics, some of your concepts with the machinery adaptation, you know, to culture this sort of grazing mantra. And yeah, it's been really good to hear all the different subjects that you covered here tonight. Hopefully some of our producers have been provoked. We have a real good movement here in Ontario, I think, in our cash crop sector to bring that cover crop into their rotation, which we just need to optimize with some cattle on it as well. So I think your notes about us taking that first step on the cash crop operations to move into that is just a good challenge for our guys with cattle to be the next step into that equation. So with that, I think we have hit our hour, 9 o'clock. You've probably got supper waiting for you out there. So we do hope in the future, Steve, we can have you maybe for another one of these if the COVID keeps looming over us, and if not, and we do get past it with our vaccinations and our herd health, we'll hopefully have you here in Ontario at some point in the future. So appreciate all our producers for taking time tonight to attend this. And as much as we're all zoomed out, I think having cattle on a Zoom is good for our health. It's great to see the cattle on the screen instead of a bunch of bubbleheads. So we'll all meet again hopefully soon. And thanks again on behalf of beef producers in Ontario, Steve. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. God bless.
Yep. Have a good night.
Good night.